Okay, so what we're doing today is the Tullahoma Campaign.
Yes.
And that it occurs in the middle of June and July
1863.
1863. And but there are two other campaigns at that time, which everybody knows about.
The Gettysburg Campaign going on in Maryland and then on into Pennsylvania, and the Vicksburg Campaign, which at this point is pretty much turned into a siege in Mississippi against Fortress Vicksburg to capture that important city to bring control of the Mississippi into federal hands.
So, but the Tullahoma Campaign is as important as those two.
Yeah, the Tullahoma Campaign's an overlooked but extremely important campaign in the Civil War. It really secures Tennessee definitively for the United States for the rest of the Civil War. Eastern Tennessee, which is pro-Union, has been under federal control for a good portion since the Battle of Stones River in 1862. But Middle and Western Tennessee remain outside of United States military control. And once the Tullahoma Campaign's over, Middle Tennessee falls. The Union Army of the Cumberland is sitting. United States Army of the Cumberland is sitting in Tullahoma. Bragg is still hanging out for a little bit in Chattanooga, but he's going to soon evacuate Chattanooga and retreat back into Georgia. But once you control Middle Tennessee, you also control Western Tennessee, which is the pro-secessionist area. Middle Tennessee's in between. But if you control that, you've eliminated a great deal of resources as well as territory from secessionist control, and they can no longer use as bases for supply and get things like food from Tennessee anymore. And you're going to lose a couple important rail lines that help connect the Eastern and Western Confederacy. When Shelbyville, which is going to be one of the targets of the Tullahoma Campaign, is a modestly important rail center, and Chickamauga, which is the ultimate goal, is the real important rail center in southern Tennessee, I should say. And if you control that, you control the gateway as well into Georgia.
And into Atlanta.
Yeah, the deep south and the heartland of the so-called Confederacy is open to U.S. invasion. U.S. forces can move into those regions.
Well, two people that is not well known to the average person in the Civil War,
William Rosecrans, who's the commander of the Army of the Cumberland at this time, and Braxton Bragg, the commander of the secessionist Army of Tennessee, whom faces off against the Army of the Cumberland.
Yeah, and this whole thing begins with a battle that, again, most people have never heard of.
Yeah, the Battle of Stones River takes place in late 1862, early 63. I believe it starts December 31st, actually, 1862.
They fight through the new year.
It's really not a great showing for either commander. Yeah. Rosecrans does arguably better than Bragg, but it fights through the new year in middle of December, one of the very few combat situations in the Civil War where you're actually fighting in the winter. It's miserably cold. Troops who are wounded literally freeze to death overnight because it's just so cold. And Bragg eventually is defeated. It's something of a draw, but Bragg is defeated and withdraws from the Battle of Stones River. It's by proportion the bloodiest battle in Civil War history.
Yeah, per capita.
Yeah, only about 73,000 troops were involved, and 36% of them became casualties.
That's just amazing. And Pickett's charge had 48% casualty, but that was a head-on charge into cannon.
So it's 31.4%. It's the highest percentage of casualties of any major battle.
That's amazing. And then you've got Rosecrans and Bragg, and they were two very different people.
Yes. Rosecrans was much more personable. He gets along very well with his subordinates. He doesn't get along so well with his superiors, unfortunately for him. He tends to end up quarreling with people like Grant.
Not the right person to quarrel
with. Grant is a brilliant, he's not necessarily a brilliant politician, but he's definitely a brilliant general politician. He's very good at military politics inside the army. And so that's going to hurt Rosecrans' career. Braxton Bragg, no one likes Braxton Bragg.
Yeah, you were telling me that not even his wife.
Not apparently. Apparently, I've heard, whether it's true or not, his wife told him that she thought he was completely worthless as a military commander.
Well, and his subordinates thought the same thing.
Oh yeah, the subordinates thought definitely the same thing. They were, and especially if your name is Leonidas Polk, you're conniving for overall command of the
Polk
Army of
wanted to be
Tennessee.
commander?
Yes.
Wasn't he a bishop?
He is the fighting bishop. He started out the war, when the war breaks out, he's an Episcopalian bishop. For those who live outside the United States, that's an Anglican bishop.
Yeah.
He resigns his position as bishop, joins up with the secessionist forces, and is made a general.
That's an amazing story. And he gets killed at...
Yes, during the Atlanta campaign. It's very unfortunate. He was the best general the United States had during the Civil War. His incompetence was far more valuable than his death was to the United States military cause during the conflict.
So we have this big battle, Stones River.
Yes.
You one time told me that Stones River was fought to protect Wilmington in the long run.
Bragg is moving north in Stones River. He's trying to actually get into Tennessee. Into Kentucky. He's trying to take control of Kentucky because Kentucky...
This would be his second attempt.
Yes, this is the second attempt to move into Kentucky. Kentucky is a contested state. There's a lot of secessionist support there. Ultimately, so if you can get into Kentucky, maybe you can flip Kentucky officially, completely to the secessionist side. The reality is it's not going to happen. It's much like Maryland. But he's trying to get north into Kentucky to institute the secessionist government in exile into Kentucky, but it fails. It ends up at the Battle of Stones River. Rosecrans blocks Bragg's attack, and Rosecrans is able to drive back Bragg. Now, neither general does very well in this battle. Rosecrans is surprised with a flanking maneuver, even though Bragg is only 100 yards in front of him, basically, and he's completely taken off guard by this somehow. Yeah. So it's not a great showing, and Bragg just doesn't coordinate it at all well, and he actually had a pretty good chance when he caught the Army of the Cumberland by complete surprise to, if not destroy, at least, inflict a very serious defeat. And at a time where such a defeat could have been very, very problematic from an international and domestic.
This would have been right after Fredericksburg.
This would have been right after Fredericksburg, and it could have had a very very negative reaction. But he fails to capitalize on Rosecrans' mistake, and he suffers very heavy casualties, and the Army of Tennessee is essentially destroyed. As well as the Army of the Cumberland was basically destroyed in this battle, and he is forced to withdraw back south, eventually down to the Tullahoma area.
Now, Tullahoma is what do you call it? It's a ridge.
Tullahoma it's behind this ridge of mountains, basically. Okay. It's a rail center, so it's really important to capture. It's actually in a very nice agricultural area, so you can get a lot of food out of there. But it's protected by the Highland Rim is what it's called, which has several gaps that you can get through. Yeah. But it's very hard to move through mountains if you have moving armies through mountains. It can be quite difficult.
I think one of the things that happens nowadays is I've driven through that region, and thanks to the glories of modern highways, you don't realize how rolling that section is there. But it's I know when last time I drove through it, I was sitting there thinking, I wouldn't want to take armies through this.
No, it's a difficult place to move through, but Rosecrans is going to be able to do it pretty easily.
Really, so it's called the Highland Rim. Bragg actually pulls south of this rim.
Yes, so Bragg puts himself. He has two corps, infantry corps. Hardee's and Polk's Corps, his two infantry subordinates. He places Polk near Shelbyville,
Right.
which is north of Tullahoma.
Okay.
And he puts Hardee a little bit further to the left, to Polk's right. Let's see, where not quite off the top of my head. I have it written down for this very reason. Yes, 8 miles to the right, Hardee fortifies Wartrace. That's where Hardee's Corps is placed, protecting the main road to Chattanooga, as well as being able to reinforce the other 3 passes of the Highland Rim. Bragg assumes, now Bragg is sitting in Tullahoma, that's where his headquarters is, rather stupidly, but so he's quite far removed from his subordinates. So he has Polk's and Hardee's Corps guarding these gaps. So that way, theoretically, the Army Company can't get through. He also has cavalry corps, his cavalry, Forrest Cavalry Division, as well as Wheeler's Cavalry Corps, spread out as pickets across the area to alert the Army of Tennessee of any sort of movements that the Army of the Cumberland would launch.
Okay. So now Hardee, who's going to be to Bragg's right,
Yes.
and protecting the smaller gaps.
Yes.
The 2 smaller gaps, because they're 2. Now Hardee, as opposed to Bragg, was actually quite a good strategist.
He's very much respected in the pre-war army. He's born in 1815. He's a career army officer, and he's well known as a tactician before the Civil War. He actually writes the manual that the United States Army uses at the outbreak of the war, Hardee's Tactics. The United States is going to decide by 1862 they're not going to use his tactics anymore, and they take his tactics and change like 5 or 6 things or something, and so then you get Casey's Tactics.
So yeah,
it's changed.
You just rub off the name a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he's actually well regarded as someone who knows what they're doing, and he thinks Braxton Bragg is an idiot.
Okay.
He really thinks Bragg's an idiot, has no idea what he's doing, and so he's less inclined to listen to Bragg's plans. And Bragg doesn't really tell his subordinates what's going on either. Yes, 8 miles to the right, Hardee fortifies Wartrace. That's where Hardee's Corps is placed, protecting the main road to Chattanooga, as well as being able to reinforce the other 3 passes of the Highland Rim. Bragg assumes, now Bragg is sitting in Tullahoma, that's where his headquarters is, rather stupidly, but so he's quite far removed from his subordinates. So he has Polk's and Hardee's Corps guarding these gaps. So that way, theoretically, the Army Company can't get through. He also has cavalry corps, his cavalry, Forrest Cavalry Division, as well as Wheeler's Cavalry Corps, spread out as pickets across the area to alert the Army of Tennessee of any sort of movements that the Army of the Cumberland would launch.
Okay. So now Hardee, who's going to be to Bragg's right,
Yes.
and protecting the smaller gaps.
Yes.
The 2 smaller gaps, because they're 2. Now Hardee, as opposed to Bragg, was actually quite a good strategist.
He's very much respected in the pre-war army. He's born in 1815. He's a career army officer, and he's well known as a tactician before the Civil War. He actually writes the manual that the United States Army uses at the outbreak of the war, Hardee's Tactics. The United States is going to decide by 1862 they're not going to use his tactics anymore, and they take his tactics and change like 5 or 6 things or something, and so then you get Casey's Tactics.
So
it's changed.
You just rub off the name a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he's actually well regarded as someone who knows what they're doing, and he thinks Braxton Bragg is is an idiot. Less inclined to listen to Bragg's plans. And Bragg doesn't really tell his subordinates what's going on either.
So there's no coordination.
No, there's no coordination. Everyone thinks Bragg's an idiot. Bragg doesn't get along with his subordinates, so he doesn't really tell them anything. They're not willing really to tell him anything. He has less than stellar cavalry commanders, Wheeler and Nathan Bedford Forrest. While Nathan Bedford Forrest is generally regarded as one of the better cavalry commanders of the Civil War,
But he was a loose cannon.
Yeah, he's a loose cannon. I tend to disagree with that assessment. Because first off, he is a loose cannon. He doesn't really care about the chain of command and following the chain of command. He wants to have his own thing and do his own thing. He's also, while he's very, very good at mounted infantry tactics, he's actually pretty bad at all the things that you really want cavalry to do. Cavalry is your eyes and ears in the army. They're your scouting forces. They let you know what he does. He never really does the outposting. He never does the reconnaissance. He doesn't do any of those things, and he's very bad at actually telling his superiors what is going on. He doesn't actually get the messages. And Wheeler, the other cavalry commander, he's okay. He's occasionally competent.
A workaday cavalry commander.
He's a workaday cavalry commander. He does okay. He's no one like Stuart or Buford or Minty.
Well, I was about to say though, one of the things that doomed Lee at Gettysburg was the fact that Jeb Stuart disappeared off the map.
Yeah, and that part of that's Stuart's fault, but also part of it's just how the Army of the Potomac moved to cut Stuart off as well, which you couldn't predict what that was going to happen. But Stuart does make mistakes. But Stuart is a very good cavalry commander. He's good at reconnaissance. He's good at outpost. He's good at screening. He's good at actually telling his superiors what the Union Army's going on. He's a very, very good cavalry commander. He has some issues as a cavalry commander. He's very vainglorious and likes to get his name in the paper. But as the actual meat of cavalry work, he's pretty good at that.
Well, so you're saying that neither Forrest nor Wheeler were Jeb Stuart?
No, they're not even. People like Buford or some of the other cavalry commanders on the federal side.
Yeah, Buford, of course, is. He's even loved by his troops, which is kind of unusual.
Yeah, and he was actually going. If he hadn't had died when he did, he was going to go out west to take command of the cavalry out west. Yes,
I didn't know that.
To fix up because the Western cavalry never does very well.
Okay, so we've got this. We don't exactly have a beautiful command structure on the southern side.
No.
As Rosecrans and his troops and his generals are maneuvering.
Yes, and they're going to start maneuvering several months after Stones River, because Stones River was such a destructive battle. It takes months to rebuild both armies. The command structure, the secessionists do try to fix it. Jeff Davis, the president of the so-called Confederacy, sends out Joe Johnson to look over the situation with the expectation that Johnson was going to ease Bragg out of command. But Joe Johnson, who was severely wounded at
Fair Oaks?
Yes, I believe it's Fair Oaks during the Peninsula Campaign, 1962, falls sick again due to the wounds, so he can't take over. And also, the army's actually not in terrible shape, but he doesn't want to look like the guy who's coming in and grabbing glory,
right?
Because he doesn't have a direct order to replace.
Well, Joe Johnson is often thought as one of the best of the generals on both sides.
Yes. He certainly understands what the secessionists need to do to win the war.
Yeah.
Unlike Jefferson Davis or Robert E. Lee or Braxton Bragg.
But he wasn't a favorite of Jefferson Davis.
No, Jefferson Davis, they did not like each other.
Yeah.
They did not like each other at all.
So on top of all the command problems the Confederates have, the guy who's ultimately in charge is not trusted by his president.
Yes. And Jefferson Davis also likes to stick his finger in the pies of every single military campaign unless it's run by Robert E. Lee.
Got it.
So it doesn't particularly help that, Jefferson Davis, who's a micromanager, is trying to run everything.
Well, now Rosecrans on the other side though has some really good commanders.
Yes.
And they're functioning together as a team.
Yeah, Rosecrans is very much liked by his subordinates, superiors. There's issues there, but he's liked by his subordinates, and he's actually quite well loved by his men. His army.
I didn't know that.
The army really does like Rosecrans. No one really likes Bragg, but everyone who works under Rosecrans likes Rosecrans a lot. His two probably most important subordinates in this campaign are Thomas and McCook. They very, very much get along very well with Rosecrans.
And Thomas is destined for bigger and better things.
Thomas is destined for bigger and better things after Rosecrans suffers a rather humiliating defeat and something about it seems a mental or breakdown.
Yeah.
Something like shell shock might to borrow a term from the First World War, that seems to affect him, leading to him having to be relieved of command ultimately. Yeah. And so Thomas will take command.
Grant relieves Rosecrans.
Yes, Grant relieves Rosecrans of command.
Okay, but Rosecrans has Thomas, he has McCook. They're going to be innovative about the use of infantry.
Yes. What happens? Rosecrans, while he's sitting up rebuilding his army, he only has about 9,000 cavalrymen in his army. So that's about they call it the Cavalry Corps, but it's more of basically a division of cavalry. He asked for more cavalry resources, but they turn him down. But what they do is say, what you can do is convert one of your brigades of infantry to mounted infantry. Mm. So he goes ahead and does that. He taps the brigade under the command of a guy by the name of Wilder, John T. Wilder, who takes 4 brigades. I forget the exact the regiments here, but he takes these brigades and he turns them over to mounted infantry. They use horses, they use mules, they use anything they can get that moves and is fast, so they get their hands on. He wants to arm his men with a new rifle, the Sharps rifle. It's a repeating rifle, one of the first repeating rifles. It's a lever action gun. Yeah. It's quite innovative. It's actually the first repeating rifle that uses metal cartridges.
Okay, I didn't know this.
Yeah, it's one of the first. It's I believe the first to use metal cartridges. It has a 7-chamber magazine, so you have 7 shots. The army the government doesn't want to pay for these because bureaucratic reasons. So
they don't want to pay to arm their troops
with these rifles. They're okay with the muzzle loading rifles, or maybe using your breech loading carbines like Sharps or Morels or things like that. But they don't want to give these new rifles to this brigade of troops. So Wilder actually convinces his men to buy the rifles. Now this actually comes out in the newspapers, and the government's shamed into buying the rifles, so none of the men actually spend their own money on these. But they're armed with these rifles, which means, one, it's a breech loading weapon, so it's much easier to load. You can load it in cover. You can load it
doing the muzzle loading.
You can load it from a prime position, so you're a much smaller target to hit, and you're able to fire faster. You have 7 rounds you can fire down range, and this can be just as accurate as a muzzle loading rifle, but you have faster rate of fire and more firepower you can put down range. So it's going to be much harder for anyone to take the positions you control if you have it.
Yeah, those would be great defensive weapons.
Yes, and it turns out they actually really are great defensive and fantastic offensive weapons as well.
So now, Bragg thought they would come through the big gaps in the Highland Rim, but they didn't.
No. So there are several gaps in the Highland Rim. There's Guy's Gap, which is the main one, and that's when Bragg thinks everyone might come down through. Bell Buckle Gap, which is also a pretty big one. It's not huge, but it's big enough that you can move through pretty easily. He thinks those are the 2 likely ones that they're going to come down. Then you also have Liberty and Hoover's Gap. which are much smaller.
Mm-hmm.
Hoover's is the smallest gap.
Right.
And Liberty is a bit bigger, but it's still fairly small. And Rosecrans will decide to move against all 4 gaps simultaneously.
Which is hard to do.
Which is hard to do, but this army is very well trained, and it does it pretty. It does
and he's got good
well.
commanders.
Yes, he's got very good commanders who can do that. Now, with Rosecrans kind of hanging out in his base of operations, by this point in time, it's May, June 63. And he's been staying there since, January 1863, so it's been about 6 months. And he starts getting messages from Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States, Henry Halleck, who is the General-in-Chief of the United States Armies at this time, and you should remember anything Halleck says, you really should attribute to Abraham Lincoln. Halleck is something...
Halleck is Abraham Lincoln's mouthpiece.
Yes.
Okay.
But he keeps getting messages and gets leaned on like, hey, move, why aren't you moving? You should be doing things. And eventually it comes down to, they're thinking about removing him from command and replacing him with someone else. Yeah, thinking about removing Rosecrans. And eventually it comes down like, when are you going to move? Are you going to move soon? He's like, well, if you mean soon as in tomorrow, I can't do that. If you mean soon as in, 3 or 4 days from now, you were moving then, by the way. And so they let him stay.
Well, the same thing almost happened to Thomas at Nashville. Grant, there was already a courier from Grant, wasn't there?
Yeah,
on his way
to replace him, but at that point he moved against what was left of the Army of Tennessee and destroyed it in the field.
Yeah.
Well,
of course, then Thomas is directly under Rosecrans during the Tullahoma Campaign.
Yes.
And he's the one who goes through
Hoover's Gap. June 23rd, Rosecrans begins moving his troops.
While Vicksburg is on the verge of surrendering at that moment, and Robert E. Lee is crossing the Maryland line.
Yes, he is.
So all this is going on at once.
At the very exact same time. The first movements begin on June 23rd when elements of Rosecrans' Reserve Corps in the Army of Cumberland, under Granger with Cavalry Division, moved due west from Murfreesboro, where they've been holed up for these past several months, to terrain to begin an elaborate feint.
Yeah.
So he starts moving to feint out the secessionists. It's important to note the secessionist position is very weak. It's very subject to being turned, which Hardee has told Bragg.
Really?
Yes. The position is subject to being turned if anyone gets through Hoover's Gap.
So he actually said, if they come through this gap, you're in trouble.
He points out to Bragg the position is weak and it's subject to being turned in both flanks.
I had no idea. I always thought that there's only 4 holes in the Highland Rim.
Yes.
And I would think that'd be easy to defend, but I didn't realize that.
Theoretically. If everyone can work with each other, that shouldn't be too hard. But if everyone doesn't like each other, and quite frankly, if you're able to get through one of those gaps and you can't move quickly enough, your entire position is going to be turned.
Yeah.
And that's what is going to happen. So on June 23rd, you begin movements. Bragg doesn't know what's going on because his cavalry's not telling him. And so he can't tell his subordinates what's going on. His subordinates don't know what's going on either, so no one really knows what's going on. This feint that he starts out is designed to play into Bragg's assumption that...
About Guy's Gap.
Yeah, about Guy's Gap, because it looks like you're going to go right to Guy's Gap.
Yeah.
You're going right through Guy's Gap. And that would be, and then would come with on his left flank at Shelbyville. Of course, that's not actually what's going to happen. Rosecrans' plan is to do that, but at the same time, while he's moving towards Guy's Gap with elements, is to slide around the flank through the other gaps. Whichever gap he can get through.
So he feints right and moves left.
Moves left, yes. So Rosecrans' elaborate plan is to slide Granger's corps to the left, covering Shelbyville approaches, and perform a giant right wheel of the army. While Bragg was focused on, the strongly fortified Shelbyville, which Bragg does.
He fortifies Shelbyville.
Yeah.
But that's on the other end of the line.
That's on the other end of the line. There's not really a huge number of federal troops going towards it. Thomas's corps would perform a right flank march and would move southeast on the Manchester Pike to grab Hoover's Gap, which is on Hardee's right flank. It's actually beyond his right flank, essentially. The gap is very lightly manned, so speed...
It's the narrowest of
it's
the
very
gaps.
narrowest of the gap, so it's also theoretically the easiest to defend, but it's very lightly manned, so you have to move very quick to grab it. Speed is very important for Rosecrans' plan. And this is where John T. Wilder comes in with his mounted infantry brigade. Said he was initially turned down for his requested extra cavalry resources, so Wilder's brigade is converted to mounted infantry, and this is the perfect guy to use for this. He's an aggressive commander.
Yeah.
He's very good. He has about 1,500 men under his command. He's actually from New York, interestingly enough. You know, he starts out the war raising a company of artillery. They get converted to infantry, converted back to artillery. He's actually captured. He's taken prisoner because he's forced to surrender because he has superior enemy force comes against his command at one point in time. So he spends about 2 months in prison, but he's back.
Mm-hmm.
He turns his brigade into the Lightning Brigade, and he moves quickly with his brigade with their repeating rifle Spencers to move against Hoover's Gap.
So we've got, Rosecrans is faking right and moving left.
Yes.
And they're heading for those two small gaps on the left-hand side
Yes.
of the Highland Rim.
The most important of these is going to be Hoover's Gap. That's what he wants to get through because that's going to turn the entire secessionist position so he can get to their flank and their rear. And if he can do that, he can possibly cut them off and prevent them from retreating. Therefore, he can bag a whole army if he's really lucky. Unfortunately for Rosecrans, that's not going to happen, but that is essentially something that could happen. So Bragg, once he finds out what's going on, is going to have some issues. Wilder is going to race towards the Hoover's Gap. He's going to get there.
Wilder is the mounted cavalry.
Yes, he's a mounted cavalry commander. The mounted infantry commander. He gets there very quickly, hence so instead of being called the Hatchet Brigade, which was called Hatchet Brigade because they all armed themselves with hatchets. It was a derogatory nickname. They get to be called now the Lightning Brigade because how quickly they move. Their opponents in the Hoover's Gap is the 1st Kentucky Cavalry's secessionist cavalry forces.
Mm-hmm.
They skirmish briefly with Wilder, but under heavy pressure from Wilder, they are going to withdraw. But they are unable to reach the gap before the Lightning Brigade gets there. Mainly because the Lightning Brigade has actually better fed horses. Their horses are in better condition. The army,
that's startling.
Yeah, the Army of Tennessee, even though it's sitting in a very rich agricultural area, has a supply problem.
Really?
They're not getting the food and fodder needed for their horses.
And that ricochets back on top of Bragg then, because I mean that's what you do.
Yes. So Bragg gets blamed for a lot of things that aren't his fault.
His fault, yes.
Yeah, he has very difficult subordinates who are constantly scheming against him or don't want to do what they actually should. You have people like Polk who are just incompetent morons who do whatever he wants and doesn't listen to orders. You have people like Forrest who just does what he wants because he doesn't care.
Yeah.
You have people like Hardee who knows what they're doing and dislikes you. So he has a lot of issues. Yeah. But he's still not a very good commander. He's actually not very good at what he does.
Yeah.
But with the poor horses, they're not able to get to this gap and close it off.
Yeah.
So Wilder's brigade is going to shoot through this gap, end up on the right side of it, and be able to hold it. There is a brigade under William B. Bate, secessionist brigade under William B. Bate, who's going to be supported by Bushrod Johnson's brigade. Yeah. These are both secessionist brigades, as well as some artillery are going to assault Liberty Gap. Mm-hmm. It's a very narrow gap, but they're driven back by the Spencer rifles, which again are repeating rifles. So they have much greater fire.
You're saying that they're good defensive weapons.
They have that makes sense. Much greater firepower than what the secessionists are able to bring to bear. And Wilder's going to be able to hold the gap until the main infantry units of the 14th Corps, this is Thomas's Corps, arrive to secure the position against any further assaults. So once Federal Infantry Corps arrive at Hoover's Gap is completely in Federal control.
And then there's nothing that can be done.
There's nothing you can do. Maybe you can bring your whole army against it if you're lucky, but
you would have to move the whole army.
Yes.
By the right flank.
Yes.
And that would be
be very hard to do.
Yeah.
And you're going to try to have to move through some somewhat rough terrain without having perfect knowledge of what's going on. Plus, you would still have that feint going on towards Shelbyville. You can't necessarily pull out of Shelbyville and go against.
And Shelbyville's on the left-hand side of the line, and
Hoover's on the right
side. So
you can't just pull out of Shelbyville and go against Thomas's Corps, because then you have left who knows how many troops in your flank and rear.
Well, yeah, and you can always turn a feint into the real thing. If you see the other side moving in the wrong direction. Yeah,
and who knows? Maybe this grabbing of Hoover's Gap is an actual feint as well.
Yeah.
What do you do? And without receiving information from people like Wheeler and Forrest, you don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And also Bragg is far too far to the rear to actually control what's going on.
He's far too far to the rear. That's really odd.
Yeah, so he's his headquarters at Tullahoma.
Yeah.
While the rest of his army is at Shelbyville and Wartree.
That just seems so strange to me. Because Lee was literally at Antietam in the middle of the day. He was literally standing just feet from the front line.
Yeah.
Looking at what was going on.
Yeah. Most commanders would be much closer, but Bragg was in Tullahoma.
That's just amazing. So now Bragg's lost his right-hand flank here. The troops are coming through.
Yeah, it's turned. His flank is turned. If he does nothing, because this pike will lead right down towards Manchester. They can swing to the left, grab Tullahoma. There's no one really in Tullahoma, and the Army of Tennessee will be trapped south of Murfreesboro and north of their supply lines. So you can try to attack.
Got to get out of there.
Yeah, they can either try to attack the heavily fortified Murfreesboro, which good luck on that one.
Yeah.
Or you try to fight your way out south in the heavily fortified Tullahoma, which the Union Army would be occupying if he does nothing, or you simply surrender your army.
Yeah, I was going to say, he's in danger of a double envelopment.
Yes.
He's going to have him.
He's going to have, he could be very much enveloped on both flanks. So Thomas's Corps comes through here. Thomas, once his troops start going through, he shakes Wilder's hand and told him, "You've saved the lives of 1,000 men here by your gallant conduct today. I didn't expect to get to this gap for 3 days."
Yeah.
So, Thomas is quite happy.
And Thomas thinks he's going to have to fight his way through.
Yeah.
But he doesn't have to.
He doesn't. No, he can just march right through with his army.
That's amazing.
With his corps, I should say. So
he takes a whole corps through that gap.
Yeah. Matter of fact, basically the entire army of the Cumberland will move through that gap.
Yeah.
So, meanwhile, there's actually another action going on that's further confusing, the secessionist commanders at Liberty Gap. The only two battles that go on in this campaign, Liberty Gap and Hoover's Gap. At Liberty Gap, which is 6 miles to the west, a similar battle is going on to what happened at Hoover's Gap. Leading out elements of General Cook's Corps advance. 39th Indiana is the leading element here under the command of a guy named Thomas Harrison. He is the commander. They're also a mounted infantry regiment, and they are also armed with Spencer rifles.
This is unusual though, to have mounted infantry.
Yes.
And mounted infantry with Spencer's wife. There's no way that the Southern commanders could have expected this.
No.
Okay.
Unless they were actually paying attention.
Okay.
And you had, your cavalry doing their job.
Yeah, which wasn't happening. And you actually had people telling Bragg what was going on, which wasn't happening. And you actually had a better commander than Bragg. Yeah.
In charge of things, which wasn't happening. So, you have another mounted infantry regiment, this time rather than a brigade, a regiment grabs this gap. Harrison doesn't wait for infantry support. So what he actually does, he goes forward and attacks. Now McCook orders him to grab this gap.
Right.
So you get a brigade of infantry coming up, but there's not a lot here. These are just the leading elements of your corps. So this is basically your basically early reconnaissance force in case you hit something and you need to fight a little bit before your reinforcements come up. So these guys go forward and they're able to drive the secessionist forces out of Liberty Gap. Mm-hmm. It's actually much more heavily defended than Hoover's Gap. So they're going, and there's actually pretty good defenses put up in here. So it's not a cakewalk like Hoover's Gap's going to be.
And this would also be under Hardee at this point.
This is Hardee's sector, yes. Yeah. So a brigade under the command of August Willich, a federal brigade, moves forward, and they deploy an infantry regiment on each side of the road, and they basically launch a frontal assault up these slopes and conduct some flanking operations. As they find these are just too heavily defended, they start moving to the flank with these regiments and are able to eventually force the Confederate brigades of St. John R. Little and S.A.M. Wood out of their positions.
Well, that sounds like almost a double envelopment.
Yes,
again.
Basically what happens there is they double envelop the positions, and the secessionists are forced to withdraw.
Yeah.
Willich also had an opportunity. This is one of the Federal Brigade commanders to test a tactic he developed while he was a prisoner of war. He had been captured. Used something called advancing fire. He used the 49th Ohio, which is under his command. He deploys his men into 4 rows.
Okay. And
what they do is, as one row fires, another row can advance while others are reloading.
Got it.
So they can have this continuous amount of fire being put down as they move forward.
Now I know this is not quite accurate, but that almost sounds like World War I tactics.
Yes, fire and maneuver.
Yes.
Where and so these are tactics that have been existed for a little while, but the United States military isn't very good, actually. And contrary to what people might think, was not very good in the 19th century.
Yeah.
It was. It doesn't get really good until the Second World War.
Yeah.
So they use this innovative tactic. You have these 4 rows, and they're able to continuously advance, providing a great deal of firepower, really a lot of pressure on the secessionists, and they're able to. They're going to force them out. A second Union brigade arrives later on. By this point, the secessionists are pushed out, and the secessionists will launch a couple of piecemeal attacks and probing attacks. But at this point in time, the Federal forces are pushed about 1.5 miles beyond the end of the gap. So they have control of Liberty and Hoover's Gap.
I'm really struck by the fact that there seems to be low coordination at all between the Confederate troops.
No, there's absolutely none.
Flank has been turned.
Right. Oh, the right flank's gone.
Gone. Yeah.
Unless you want to get captured, yeah. You can.
So now, what are Bragg's choices here?
He can maneuver to try to maneuver against Liberty Gap and Hoover's Gap, or maybe try to do a spoiling attack up through his guy's gap to try to throw off Rosecrans' movements, and maybe force Rosecrans into a battle that might force the army of the Cumberland to withdraw or have to pull troops back to confront Bragg.
So we're talking about a stand-up, fixed-piece battle if you do that.
Yeah. Or you retreat. You really have 2 options. You maneuver against where the enemy forces are coming through. You could always sit there and get captured, but that's not really an option now, is it?
No.
You can retreat, or you can say, to heck with it, I'm going to launch an attack and see if I can disrupt enemy movements. You basically do a spoiling attack to throw off the Union forces. He picks to retreat eventually.
Which actually sounds reasonable to me.
Yes, it probably was. I mean, someone like Grant may have gone with the spoiling attack, or Lee would have gone with the spoiling attack, and quite frankly, that may have been actually very valuable, considering it was such a small, it was just a fainting movement that he was facing.
Well, you know, if Bragg had gone on his left flank, if Bragg had gone forward, as you say, up the guy's pass, then Rosecrans would have had the same problem that Bragg had.
Yes.
At that moment, because his right flank would have been
being turned. Well, they would both have the same exact problem. Both of their flanks are being turned simultaneously, and then then what happens?
Yeah, there's a vague recollection that was something like what happened at Murfreesboro.
May have been.
Yeah, but anyway, so Bragg, faced with the choice of being aggressive or defensive, decides to go defensive.
Yeah.
Now,
when he should have gone aggressive.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, how could he have gone aggressive? Nobody was listening to him.
This is true. I mean, at this point, it's definitely retreating wasn't a bad idea.
Yeah.
Tullahoma is pretty heavily fortified, so withdrawing to Tullahoma makes sense.
Makes sense.
And it's and really Shelbyville's kind of nice to have, but if you lose it,
you lose it.
You lose it.
Yeah.
You'll lose some nice agricultural area, you'll lose some rail lines, but it's like you can always go back and take them back.
Right.
They're not it's not hard to do. Tullahoma is more important. Really, far more importantly is Chattanooga, so you might want to withdraw to help Tullahoma defend.
Well, I've always wondered that. Why did Bragg just, I don't know if the right term is bug out, but why does Bragg just fall on the other side of the mountains of Chattanooga? I mean, I've never really understood that.
His command structure.
Really?
Well, we'll get there soon once we talk about the breakout from Hoover's Gap and why he eventually bugs out completely, and who is really to blame for that.
Right flank is turned. Bragg, in part because of his command structure, is retreating.
He's going to retreat.
He's falling back, and so where do we go? So what happens?
So first, the Union forces are actually going to have to stop after the first 17 days of this campaign. It's a very rainy, wet time in Tennessee.
Okay.
There's a joke amongst the Union forces that Tullahoma comes from the Greek. Tella is the Greek word for mud, and Homa means more mud. So it's a very wet maneuver. So basically, Rosecrans has to stop because things bogged down, and he has to get. First off, he has to know what's going on because things have actually moved pretty quick. I think much faster than he expected. He also needs to let the roads dry out, so that way his troops can move again because these are mud roads, these are dirt roads. You try to move, a battery of artillery. Not only do you have the 6 guns with its limbers, you have forge limbers. You have wagons that go with that. You're probably looking about. So now my friends from reenacting will probably yell at me when they hear me say this. Probably at least 20 or 30 wagons per artillery battery. They'll probably point out how it's actually higher or lower than that on Facebook, but whatever. I'll accept that. But so you have say 30 wagons, counting your limbers and your artillery pieces. In an artillery battery, that's going to chop up that road pretty good. And then each regiment has, I think, about, if I remember correctly, about 5 to 10 wagons that are attached to it constantly. They drop most of their wagons on movement, but you do have a certain number that come with you all the time. So, artillery battery with 30, say a brigade with 30 wagons for the regiment, say 40 wagons in 4 regiments, plus you have
mud is deep.
Yeah, plus you have your more dedicated wagons that aren't going to move as fast, your heavier supplies for the brigades and the regiments further behind, and if you have a battery of artillery supporting that brigade, that's another 30 wagons. Yeah. So you could be moving a couple hundred wagons for a division, for a brigade I should say, with an artillery support down a road. That's going to tear up your roads pretty quick. So Rosecrans is going to have to stop because he needs to let these roads dry out to move.
Well, after 17 days of combat, even Patton would have a hard time having his pieces, getting every piece organized properly.
Without radios.
Without radios, that's right.
So,
I forgot about that.
So, he has to and things are moving quicker than I think anyone expected on the Union side. They definitely thought they'd have to fight their way through Hoover's Gap. Now all of a sudden, now you can just go right through. But you're going to have to stop briefly. It's going to slow the Union advance, but the Army of the Cumberland has, as some military historians put out, an absolutely flawless execution of Rosecrans' plans that allowed the Union Army to take possession of 2 key passes in the Highland land and was in the position to turn. In fact, I'd say it already has turned Bragg's flank. On June 25th, Bates and Johnson renew their attempts to drive the Union men out of Hoover's Gap, which they fail, while Patrick Claiborne, one of a division commander,
and considered the Stonewall of the West.
Yes, probably one of the best division commanders on either side. Sadly, yes. Sadly, he has some politically inconvenient ideas that he's expressed by this point in time, so his career has come to a grinding halt. Yeah. He's not necessarily big into the slavery thing, which in a cause that's all about slavery, slightly problematic, especially if you say, I think we should arm the slaves and grant them freedom after this war so we can, become independent. Very pragmatic, very something that the founding fathers did in the Revolution, but was completely beyond the ability of the secessionists themselves to do. Kills his brigade. He's actually a very good division commander. But he launches attacks, but they're both unsuccessful. And Claiborne, he will push back Federal forces for a time and causing 20% casualties on the 77th PA, but he's not going to be able to do anything. Their reinforcements will come through and pretty much stop that. Rosecrans is going to bring because of this, as he stops, and what he decides to do is basically pull everyone and move down Hoover's Gap. Bragg is still, at this time, even though Rosecrans has come to a complete stop, is still in the dark. During this lull, Bragg takes no effective action because his cavalry commanders are still failing him.
Wow.
They were not relaying intelligence to him, notably, most importantly, Forrest is not doing this, telling him of the weak nature of the Union right. And Wheeler fails to report on the movement of Crittenden's Corps, another one of Rosecrans' corps, through Bradleyville towards Bragg's rear. So...
this guy's moving, and his corps are moving toward Bragg's rear.
Yeah.
And he doesn't know this.
He doesn't know this.
Okay.
Complete breakdown. I mean, this is the perfect study on...
This is almost unbelievable.
Study on how to effectively run a good campaign, and also an excellent study on the complete breakdown of command.
Wow.
Bragg is eventually finally going to become aware of this by June 26th. And that of significant fighting on his right flank and the actions on his left are feints.
So he just becomes aware on the 26th?
Yes.
Oh, my Lord.
And he orders Polk to take his corps on a night march towards Murfreesboro through Guy's Gap. So he actually decides that he's going to do is launch an attack through Guy's Gap, which is actually a good idea.
Yeah.
It's actually a brilliant idea. But Polk,
Not good.
being Polk, objects to the difficulty of this assignment, and eventually Bragg calls off this attack.
Sheridan fired Warren under similar circumstances.
Even Warren didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah.
Warren got lost because of bad maps.
Right. And Sheridan sacks him. I mean, this is the military. They should do.
Yeah, or at least send an order saying you're going to do this because I'm telling you to do this.
Yeah. What is that called? A preemptory order?
I don't know, but I mean, if you get an order from your superior that says I'm ordering,
go do this,
you have to do it.
Oh, well.
But eventually, so and Polk says no. Eventually, pulls it off. As he comes to realize the threat from Thomas.
Yeah.
Now he probably.
Thomas, just to back up, Thomas is coming down through Guy's Gap.
Hoover's Gap.
Hoover's Gap. Excuse me. Hoover's Gap, and he's got his whole corps with him.
Yeah.
And so, and
plus the rest of the large sections of the rest of the Union Army.
It's really a disaster from the point of view of the secessionists.
Yes, and you know who says it's an actual disaster is Bragg at the end of the campaign.
Really?
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yes. But anyhow, so Thomas is moving through the gap, and Bragg is like, oh crap.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Rosecrans, things are going great for Rosecrans, orders McCook to withdraw from Liberty Gap, because who cares anymore?
Yeah.
And move to the north, skirt around the upper reaches of Highland Land, and exploit Thomas's breakthrough at Hoover's Gap.
Yeah.
So now, now instead of, hanging out and waiting, because you don't need Liberty's Gap anymore, you don't need Bell Buckle Gap, you don't need, Guy's Gap, you have Hoover's Gap, you're sitting on the flank of the secessionist forces, why not go through there?
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately for Bragg, Hardee is also contributing to his difficulties. It's not just Polk.
Yeah.
Hardee mistrusts Polk, mistrusts Bragg. To say that the Army of Tennessee High Command was a den of vipers would be, to put it kindly. Honestly, I'd rather be stuck in that pit in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade than be put in the High Command of the Army of Tennessee at this point. That'd be a much more enjoyable experience being trapped in a pit of snakes.
Wow.
But for the past several months, there's this issues. Hardee and Polk don't understand Bragg's plans. Hardee complained about the unsuitability of the Tullahoma position, but rather than assuming Bragg and Joe Johnson, who was sent west to look at all this and hopefully take command, rather than assuming that they understood what's going on and why this is bad, and they had insignificant knowledge of his plans. As Stephen Woodward said, Hardee takes this as a situation of further proof of his long-held notion that Bragg was an idiot.
Yeah.
And he pursued a course that he deemed best for saving an army whose commander was an idiot.
Oh my God.
So this course was to order his forces under Major General. This course was to order his force at Hoover's Gap to retreat towards Wartrace. So he leaves the gap completely uncovered. If he had withdrawn in the direction of Manchester, he might have been able to actually fight a delaying action that would have allowed, a delay to Rosecrans' forces moving down on top of Tullahoma.
Yeah.
Instead, he retreats he pulls Major General Alexander P. Stewart, his subordinate, a division commander. Important to note that major generals in the secessionist forces are of a lower rank than in the United States forces. A major general in the U.S. Army is essentially a corps or army commander, where a major general in the secessionist army is a division commander.
Okay.
So, just so that way, in case people get confused, he is a division commander under Hardee. So he orders this guy back, and he simply makes Thomas's breakout all the more effective.
Yeah, there's nobody in front of him.
There's no one in front of him. So he leaves Bragg absolutely no alternatives than to order himself and Polk to withdraw to Tullahoma on June 27th.
Wow. That would be the end of the Tullahoma Campaign.
Mostly.
The fact that, there's this general withdrawal, the breakout at Hoover Gap
Yes.
has now turned into a flood.
Yes.
And
the entire, at this point, everyone except for the feigning elements are basically moving towards Hoover's Gap.
Yeah.
There's going to be some fighting around Shelbyville. Those feigning elements are going to do some things around Shelbyville that's going to drive through. But, there's other things going on, at the same time to cause more problems for our friend Bragg. Not that he really cares so much about these at this point. Wilder's brigade is going to be sent off on a raid. They're going to go towards Manchester. They're going to arrive there by 8 a.m. on June 27th. So, had Hardee actually withdrawn that direction, or had his troops over there withdraw down that direction, Manchester would not have fallen, because, a brigade isn't going to be overwhelmed.
Right.
Anything like that. So, and by noon, and he's going to occupy it by noon. Rousseau and Brannan, who are division commanders I believe it's under Thomas's division, push their divisions towards Wartrace as Stuart, the secessionist commander, withdraws. In the west, Granger and Stanley are continuing to demonstrate at Guy's Gap. With their forces, they receive orders in an attempt to actually move forward at this point to go through Guy's Gap and capture Shelbyville. Stanley's cavalry easily pushed aside their enemies, their secessionist counterparts, and approached the breastworks of Shelbyville, which has now mostly been abandoned by Polk's.
I know, I was going to say, it's got to be a bit
pretty much
isolated
abandoned.
at this
Yeah,
point.
it's gone. Polk has withdrawn. There is some resistance remains, and Colonel Robert H. Minty, probably one of the best cavalry commanders during the war on either side, personally led his Sabre Brigade. He was actually a former cavalry officer in the British Army.
Really?
Yes, he served in Africa. He served in several other places, and he was very big on using the saber. Hence why they call it the Sabre Brigade of Michigan cavalrymen in a mounted charge over the breastworks at the retreating secessionists.
Amazing.
Yeah, he's a very good cavalry commander. He's unheard of.
Yeah, I until this moment, I had never heard of him.
Yeah, I had to look him up myself when I was doing a bit more research on this, because I was not familiar with Minty. But people who study that aspect of the war have a great deal of respect for Minty. He's a very good cavalry commander. He's essentially the Buford of the East, and things that he's did in the West, I should say, were a bit more impressive than even Buford. Buford gets support at Gettysburg, but he's able to hold off a lot more troops without any infantry support. So he's a pretty impressive cavalry commander who's sadly forgotten.
Yeah, as I say, this was the first time I ever heard of him.
Yes, very good. I was reading into him. I was like, well, this guy's like, wow, yeah, he really is a very impressive cavalry officer. But yeah, a cavalry officer from the British Army, and he's serving as brigade commander in the United States Army during the Civil War.
Some people like what they do.
Yeah, well, he was actually civilian when the war breaks out. He had left the British Army, and he was, I believe, an engineer as well. He was doing something, and war ends. Goes back home, has like 10 children or some such nonsense as that. And continues on his life and dies in the late 19th or early 20th centuries. I forget exactly when he died. Yeah.
What a life.
Exactly.
What if he ever wrote a biography?
No, I don't think so.
Oh,
that is unfortunate. On June 28th, after this place had where was it captured? Manchester was captured. Wilder's brigade leaves on a raid to damage the railroad infrastructure in Bragg's rear and heads south towards Deckard.
Yeah.
He crosses the rain-swollen Elk River, which is in his way. It's a significant obstacle because, again, it's flooding, but they knock down a mill, construct raft and float their
why not?
their howitzers across the river, and they defeat the small...
So they're making it up as they go. Very aggressive.
Yes, Wilder's the perfect guy for this type of stuff.
Yeah.
He's an aggressive commander. He's actually quite intelligent.
Yeah.
He's starts out as an infantry commander because he's an infantry brigade. He's actually, I think, probably a better cavalry commander than people realize. Yeah. He's basically using Forrest's tactics against secessionists here, and they defeat the small garrison there. They tore up about 300 yards of track.
And they would be in the back of Bragg by this time.
Oh, yeah. They burn the railroad depot, which is filled with rations.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Yeah, that
helps.
That's going to help the secessionists even more. The next morning, they ride onto the foothills of the Cumberland Mountains, reaching the town of Shawnee, where
Yeah.
Leonidas Polk has chosen to build the University of the South.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And where
I've
they
done
where they destroy a branch rail line, and although they're pursued by a much larger secessionist force, the Lightning Brigade makes it back to Manchester by noon, June 30th, and they do not lose a single man on this
You're kidding.
entire raid.
That's amazing.
Yes. So you know the secessionists, the things keep on going badly indeed. Bragg, he's not overly concerned about this raid to the rear. It's really not a big thing. Most of the damage is pretty quickly repaired. I mean, the rations are gone. That's an issue, but it doesn't cause terribly much. And as Bragg retreated to Tullahoma, he gets in Tullahoma, which is fortified, and he builds up. He has these fortifications, and his men sit there and wait for a frontal assault from Rosecrans. And Rosecrans actually plans to do this because that's about the only thing you can do. However,
I'm almost afraid to hear what comes next.
Polk was overly concerned about the fate of the army.
Yeah.
So sitting behind fortifications in Tullahoma wasn't good enough for Polk.
And where are we going with this?
He's worried about the army with its communications cut off even temporarily and counsels Bragg to retreat.
My God.
Hardee, who I think we've already discussed, has absolutely no faith in Bragg whatsoever.
Right, yeah.
Refused to specifically recommend a retreat, but he also did absolutely nothing to encourage Bragg to stay.
This is really a true class in how not to do things.
Yes.
Yeah, you know, Ike at least talked to his commanders.
Yes.
You know, so.
But Hardee does absolutely, he offers no encouragement to stay and fight.
Yeah.
You know, at least, if Hardee at least sat there and said, hey, it's just temporary, we got nice fortifications here, you know, maybe we do have to retreat, but let's let them attack us and see how things going.
Sure.
Maybe Bragg would have stayed and probably would have damaged the army of the Cumberland pretty badly, because these are fortifications and you're going to have to take them, and Rosecrans has no other options.
And they've had time to build them.
Yeah. So, you know, what are you going to do? A day later at 3 p.m. on June 30th, Rosecrans plans to assault the next day, July 1st, frontal assault on Tullahoma. At 3 p.m., June 30th, Bragg issues orders for a nighttime withdrawal. Abandons the fortifications and decides to bug out and across the Elk River. By leaving before the Union assault, Bragg, of course, gives up a very good opportunity to inflict very serious, potentially extremely serious damage to the Army of the Cumberland.
Yeah.
But he gives up and withdraws back across the Elk River, giving up these fortifications to Rosecrans. The Army of Tennessee takes up positions below the Elk River, but Hardee and Polk convince Bragg to move even further south to the town of Crowan. As Stephen Woodworth wrote, the resolute and well-conceived Union advance and the constant carping and non-compliance of his generals seemed to have broken Bragg down. I can understand that.
Well, yeah.
Physically and emotionally, he suffered from a collection of physical ailments, including a painful case of boils that prevented him from mounting his horse to survey battle lines. The Rosecrans position was not well defensible, and the army remained there only until the evening of July 2nd. Without consulting his corps commanders on July 3, last day of the Battle of Gettysburg, Bragg ordered a retreat to Chattanooga. The army crosses the Tennessee River on July 4th, the day Vicksburg surrenders.
Yeah, and the day that Lee begins to lead the battlefield of Gettysburg.
That evening. A cavalry pursuit under Phil Sheridan, who has not yet ended up in the East yet, was not successful in
He's not yet Phil Sheridan.
He's not yet Phil Sheridan. Was not successful in trapping the rear guard of Bragg's army before they crossed the river. Oh well. all the secessionist units were encamped near Lookout Mountain by July 7th.
That is just an it indicates why. First off, it indicates why you need good people skills.
Yes.
You know,
Or at least
you
functional people skills.
Functional. Okay. Yeah. We'll scrub good. How about functional?
Yeah.
You know, one of the things though too is that you know, presence count. And I was thinking, you know, Doug MacArthur may not have been the best people skilled person,
No.
but his presence,
Yeah.
you know, dominated subordinates.
I mean, if you have if you're a commander and you at least walk into the room and people believe you're going to do well, even if you can't deal with them.
Yeah.
People like Patton.
Yeah.
You know, they'll at least do what you tell them to do because
Right.
they assume that you're competent. If you have no skills and
Right.
your people think you're an absolute moron,
Yeah.
you end up like Bragg and have no support from your subordinates and have no ability to do anything.
Well, in fairness to Bragg, the fact that Polk was still there,
Yeah,
talk goes to Jefferson Davis.
yeah. Polk and Jefferson Davis are good friends.
Yeah, and so you can't fire your boss's good buddy.
Yeah.
You know, and so
I mean, it would have been. I mean, again, you know, Polk's incompetence
yeah.
and insubordination were so valuable to the United States war effort. It's a shame that he got blown up by the United States artillery.
Yeah.
You know, he's, as I said, he's the best general that the United States Army had during the Civil War. He didn't intend to be, but
You know, if you're watching this video, Polk was on the southern side.
yes.
And,
At least we think he was.
well, yeah. And we're saying how much he helped the North.
But you know, the Tullahoma Campaign really is a brilliant campaign.
Yeah.
I mean, Rosecrans has the right people. He's the
Yeah.
right guy. He's got the right army. You know, luckily for him, I mean, he's helped by the fact that he has a very weak opponent.
Yeah.
But even against a stronger opponent with better command structure, it would have been difficult, I think, for anyone to withstand against that. I mean,
Yeah.
once you're through Hoover's Gap, you have really
Yeah, your position
retreat
is gone.
or attack, really.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, I think Rosecrans would have been more than willing to sacrifice Murfreesboro for Tullahoma.
Yeah, for the breakthrough to
Yeah.
because if you take Tullahoma, then eventually Murfreesboro is cut off.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, Grant takes. I mean, you know, it was quite clear by the time this is all going on, Vicksburg's is going to fall. It's not a matter of if; it's a matter of when. So what if Murfreesboro falls?
Right.
And you know, your supply lines are going to be opened up by Grant.
Right.
Grant can bring his army east.
East. Yeah.
And you can envelop the secessionist army who's now cut off from its homeland,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and envelop it and destroy it either in surround it with two armies and besiege it out, you know, and take it at Murfreesboro, or destroy it in the field and, you know, crush it in the field between two armies. Either case, you know, that's another. I have let's see, what is the size of the Army of Tennessee? Because it's 30,000 men thereabouts at Vicksburg that would be taken.
Mm-hmm.
So then you have, so that's one field army completely gone.
Right.
That's another around 45,000 men out of the Army of Tennessee gone. So that's two field armies wiped off the face of the map.
In the course of less than a month.
In the course of less than a month. That would have been there would have been no significant secessionist forces.
Yeah.
You know, maybe
Atlanta would have been toast.
Atlanta was Chickamauga, which is the gateway to the secessionist heartland, is toast. Atlanta's toast. Atlanta's toast. There's nothing between Atlanta and the sea. There's no. Georgia's flat and open. There's no significant rivers, and all the rivers that they do have run this way instead of across the path of advances, and the ones that do run across the path of advances aren't very big.
Not very substantial.
You know, you can get across them pretty easily. You still need bridges, but you can build bridges fairly quickly if you have good enough engineers.
Well, I've driven through that part of Georgia extensively, and you know, you do not cross large bridges unless you're going across the Savannah River.
Yeah.
But that's going the wrong way.
Yeah, and Savannah, so Savannah's toast.
Yeah.
There's about 30,000 men in Savannah, but you have all of Grant's army, you have basically an army group coming down on top of you.
And they're going to cut all those railroads, and all that food is going to be gone.
The Atlanta is the second large. Atlanta starts out the war about 10,000 people. It's a semi-important city. By 1863, 1864, it's the second largest industrial center in the South. It's probably the most important city outside of Richmond and Petersburg in the South. You take Atlanta, you take Savannah, you're a third most important port city.
Mm-hmm.
The Carolinas are open up for invasion. When you go through the Carolinas, what do you got left? You got Lee's army facing down the Army of the Potomac. You have an army group plus another army barreling down in the 60,000 man army in Northern Virginia. It's over.
Yeah, and I was thinking that outside of some astonishingly bad luck at Chickamauga,
yeah,
the war could have ended.
Oh yeah,
much more quickly.
Oh yeah, I think had Rosecrans not had issues with Grant. Now they were friends before the war,
yeah.
But there's a battle of Lucca, I believe it is. They have a falling out for some reason. Now it seems like Grant's staff work was poor. Now why that's the case, was staff just they have a bad day? Were they doing something trying to promote Grant over Rosecrans? Was there just simply miscommunications between Grant and his staff?
Yeah.
I think it's probably more likely just the staff work had a bad day,
yeah.
Or something like that, and there were miscommunications that caused the issues. But they were actually very good friends, and had Rosecrans, even if, let's say, everything goes down the way it does at Chickamauga, the war still would probably have ended at least six months earlier, because Rosecrans could have been used in the East Coast, the Army of the James, which gets bottled up during the which Rosecrans, that would never happen under Rosecrans.
Well,
heck, he would have captured. They could have sent him out to Wilmington, and Wilmington would have been captured the first to try.
Well, what I'm thinking about there was, you were talking about the Army of the James. If I'm going, who knows? I mean, history's very flexible. But it would seem to me that if Rosecrans had been Army of James, Cold Harbor would never have happened.
No, because Rosecrans, he's not, I want to say the old snapping turtle, but that's Meade.
That's Meade.
That's Meade. It's the other really ugly commander, Butler. That's his name.
Yeah, Ben Butler.
Ben Butler.
Ben.
Yes. Yeah. But Butler gets himself bottled up because Butler's an idiot.
Mm-hmm.
Rosecrans is not an idiot. He would not have let himself get bottled up by a single, I think it's corps.
Yeah.
It's not even, it's a weak corps as well that gets him bottled up. Rosecrans would have gone through that like a hot knife through butter and been sitting in Richmond, Petersburg, and Grant could have just sat there at Cold Harbor and been like,
well, I mean, they took away, Beauregard, who's there at Petersburg,
yeah,
they took away almost all his troops.
To give to Lee because the actual the threat is Grant coming south.
Yeah.
And then
not Butler.
Yeah, not Butler. But if you had put Rosecrans there, Lee would have been in a bind because Rosecrans is a good general.
Yeah.
And even if, let's say, Grant had given orders to say, hey, just sit there and look threatening.
Yeah.
Rosecrans could definitely have done that and looked threatening, and you could not have pulled troops out because it's been like you actually have someone who's.
Yeah, you would have spread Lee very thin.
Yes, you would spread Lee very thin. Richmond if Richmond falls, Lee probably gets out, and the question becomes, do you still end up towards Appomattox where Lee has an issue, or does Lee basically retreat try to get out towards the Carolinas like what his plan was during the Appomattox campaign?
I don't have any idea, but I mean, it would seem to me as though if Rosecrans had been south of Lee, Lee would have had to go toward Danville.
Yeah.
Just to secure his right flank.
Yeah, I mean, really, I think Rosecrans would have sacrificed Murfreesboro, which really would have been like, so what? You know, I still have my supply lines open to, you know, I'll go south to Chattanooga. You can, you know, produce a nice supply line from Chattanooga. You're sitting on the Tennessee River. That's navigable up to a certain extent. You just throw out line of, you know, to wherever you can get up to the navigable part. I'm not sure if Chattanooga's that section's navigable or not, but you know, you have a supply line out to the Mississippi, so you're supported. You know, Grant can come east with his army.
Yeah.
You know, actually it's an army group. Grant and Sherman both have armies. You know, and then you move from Chattanooga north in conjunction with Grant and Sherman.
Yeah.
You trap either, you know, Bragg comes out to fight an open field battle and gets crushed.
Yeah, which you would.
Or you sit in Murfreesboro and, you know, eat Union rations until you run out of food and then surrender your only other field army in the West. Really. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple smaller forces, but then what are you going to do? You got 30,000 men sitting in Savannah, about another 30,000 men in and around Charleston, so you have about 60,000 men maybe.
Well, the Union has about 500,000, more than 500,000 soldiers. That's the largest army in the world at this point.
Yeah. Yes.
You know, so
you know, the army, the Cumberland is about 60,000 men, 50 to 60,000 men. So I think Grant's army is about the same size.
Yeah.
So you know, you move south. And unfortunately for Bragg, the Tullahoma Campaign said it's a brilliant campaign. Abraham Lincoln thinks it's a brilliant campaign. He writes to Rosecrans, the flanking of Bragg at Shelbyville, Tullahoma, and Chattanooga is the most splendid piece of strategy I know of. He's absolutely right. The Union Cavalry Corps, David Stanley wrote, if any student of military art desires to make a study of a model of a campaign, let him take his maps and General Rosecrans' orders for the daily movements of his campaign. No better example of successful strategy was carried out during the war than the Tullahoma Campaign.
That's a remarkable story.
Yes, and you know, and I said it's a remarkably successful campaign. So it captures, you know, the United States Army drives the secessionists out of Middle Tennessee, which means all of Tennessee is now under federal control. Right. With minimal losses, the Union casualties were reported at 569.
That's amazing.
83 are killed, 473 are wounded, 13 are missing or captured. Bragg makes no casualties reports. His losses were trifling, he says. The Union Army does capture about 1,600 secessionists, though, primarily from Hardee's Corps, most of where these guys come from. And Bragg himself has to say how wonderful this is. Bragg himself, as he rode into the Tennessee mountains, he told Bishop Charles Quintard, the chaplain of the 1st Tennessee, that he was utterly broken down and that the campaign was a great disaster.
Yeah, well, from his point of view.
Oh, it was.
I mean, nothing.
No.
Nothing worked.
Nothing that worked. It was a complete disaster. You know. Now, Rosecrans is urged by Washington to immediately move against Bragg, you know, to finish the rebellion. Stanton urges Rosecrans to give the finishing blow to
Secretary of War.
Yeah, Secretary of War Stanton, the United States Secretary of War, urged that Rosecrans should immediately pursue Bragg to give the finishing blow to the rebellion. Bragg doesn't do this. He pauses to regroup. I think Rosecrans. Rosecrans to finish off Bragg. Rosecrans, I think, is right here. If you look at the topography south of Tullahoma, you're actually moving into the Appalachian Mountains.
Right.
So that's a little bit more difficult to move through. So he is going to pause and study the difficult choices to pursue into the mountains. Mm-hmm. He is going to capture Chattanooga. He's going to move against Chattanooga, and he's going to capture it. It seems that Bragg may be completely broken, but of course that's not going to be the case. Bragg is going to be reinforced by forces from the east.
Yeah.
General James Longstreet of the Army of Northern Virginia, with his corps, is going to be sent west.
Mm-hmm.
Jefferson Davis eventually prevails upon Lee to let this happen. and he is sent west and reinforces Bragg for the Battle of Chickamauga, which will lead to the Siege of Chattanooga.
Yeah.
And all that. But
And
overall, it's a brilliant campaign.
And Rosecrans disappears, but that's
Yes.
well, as I say, some really bad luck at Chickamauga.
Extremely bad luck. And very bad staff work. His staff officers don't check him.
I've got to wonder though. One thing is, given the rapidity, the speed with which events move, I do wonder if, as a commanding general, Rosecrans, if the different commanders were just tired.
I wouldn't be surprised. And that's why you have staff officers.
Yeah.
So that way, if your commanding officer is tired, you can say, wait, General. We have troops there.
Yeah.
We don't need to reinforce.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunately doesn't happen to Rosecrans. He has bad staff work, and it opens up a hole in his lines, and it's going to collapse his army. And
Unfortunately, directly across from Longstreet.
Yes. I've been in front of someone like Polk, it wouldn't matter.
It wouldn't have mattered, but Longstreet knew a few things about attacking.
Yes, Longstreet was a very good, probably one of the better secessionist commanders.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly one of the best corps commanders the secessionists had.
Yeah.
Would not have been a good army commander, I don't think.
His record in front of Knoxville was not so good.
No.
But
the several independent operations he had was not so good.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I think we've done a fairly good job on Tullahoma here.
Yes.
So